Is it on, Drew?
Yes, it is. So.
Okay. So it's just like a general overview. So this we'll be having this discussion for 45 minutes, and just as like an overview of some of the things we wanted to talk about. Some of them include identity arguments and whether they're good for the activity, whether we should integrate them, not have these discussions in debate themselves, but outside of them. Some policies tournaments can pass about things they can, rectify in terms of like historically things they've lacked, like lack of female judges, lack of counselors, what camps can do. But again, we don't want to limit the discussion. If anyone has anything to contribute in terms of diversity in debate, things we can do better, whether diversity is an issue or not, we're interested.
We want your voices.
Yeah, we want your voices.
So please participate if you have something to say.
So I was just going to start the discussion by talking about some identity arguments and whether I think they're good for the activity or not. I've run identity arguments starting last year, and while I think that they're good for the activity, I do think that as a community we haven't really created limitations or created rules about to the extent we should have these discussions. My opinion is that having these discussions about social location, racial identity, gender identity is good for the activity and almost necessary in a world where historically we've never really had these discussions, and LD's always been sort of an abstraction rather than talking about empirical realities. Does anyone want to?
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to include this subject matter in this debate space, because I feel like most people will agree, it really occupies a very unique academic sphere, right? Where the aggregation of information and advocacy skills and critical thinking, all that, it's very unique and fulfills a pretty cool role. And I think there ought to be some sort of reasonable, I suppose, I don't want to say limitations, but just rules about engaging these sort of discussions. But I think the question at the face of that then is what criterion do we use to establish how much or what is appropriate for discussion? Because I don't want to be the guy that's saying, oh yeah, you can't run identity because it ruins my policy making framework. But questions about topicality and predictability and just stasis points and stuff like that I think are legitimate concerns with regards to fairness and education.
So for example, last year Gen Fab, I ran a Wilderson app. This year for a living wage, Newark ran a reparations app as we give a reparations as a living wage back to black bodies. Do you think there are legitimate concerns that should be expressed about those positions which a lot of people would not consider topical?
I mean, personally, I don't find really any problem with a position like that. I feel like there ought to be some sort of connection with core topic literature, or at least the idea of the topic in regards to a living wage being reparation. That's probably legitimate. I mean, without seeing the app, it would be hard to do myself, but I don't think there's any sort of substantial reason to depart from topics like that. I think it does sort of a lot of time to come down to this idea of the standards on the T-shell versus the pre-field implication of the app or whatever. And I don't know if that's the greatest weighing mechanism for whether or not it's appropriate, but I just don't know what the alternative would be. Does anybody have?
I think one thing is there should be more clarity in terms of how to engage these positions, because I think a lot of debaters aren't exactly sure how to engage positions that necessarily relate to either performance in debate or either topical apps that talk about issues of oppression. With the Newark app specifically, it's the one with reparations. I think on the side of the debaters who are running these positions, I think they should be more clear as to what the reparations are, what they entail, so that negatives can engage positions. And if you're a negative and you're answering the positions, you should try to engage the position itself, because I think there's some value in that as well.
I think camps should actually teach a lecture on how to respectfully engage in these positions, because I think a lot of people are put in a position where they don't necessarily know how to answer them, without being offensive. And so I think that that's something that camps and schools should focus on, because you especially get, younger debaters, and they're like, what do I say? And they end up kind of sometimes saying offensive things.
I'm just asking in general, based on a lot of people's camp experience, do you think you're prepared, not prepared to debate these sort of arguments, whether it's identity arguments, critical arguments, yeah?
I think the issue just comes when I think a lot of times the educational value of running those types of positions is lost. and I know I'm guilty of this too, is you just like type into your Dropbox file and answers to whatever author it is, and you're not really engaging in the subject at all. You're just reading words and using them as pawns. So I think thinking about a better way in which to present the arguments or to debate them out would be more beneficial in terms of like garnering some type of educational impact or
I think an even more interesting point that I haven't really seen anyone talk about this lately is that I do believe that performance arguments should be run to debate, but I feel like a lot of the times it seems like it's becoming too trendy in the sense that like the movement and the project is kind of being co-opted because you see people who run these types of cases for like one round and then move on or something. So I'm not saying necessarily that we shouldn't like talk about these things because other people are going to do it and so on, but it seems to be the case that sometimes the popularity of these arguments and its success drives like other debaters to just use the case like as a pawn or whatever, not just negatives in answering it. But I think that it happens to a lot. It happens in a lot of cases in like app debaters too.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think like the moment that this kind of thing becomes a fad, it just becomes horribly disingenuous, and it's probably just worse for the debate community and just like worse for these kinds of awareness of these kinds of things in general. If people are just like, hey, yeah, like so many people reading this and they're winning, like let me read that too. So I think that's just like I think that's a problem with everyone. It's not a problem with like the positions or the community as a whole. It's just like each individual, like when reading these positions, like should probably really think about why they're reading them, and they should probably like in that thought process, their conclusion for like when they're reading that, if they read the position, the conclusion should probably be something along the lines like this is something I really care about and this is something that like affects me. But if it's just like Dino said, like for winning or because it's a fad or because it's cool, like I think that's not only just bad, but I think that probably undermines the work and like a lot of like personal experiences that a lot of people have gone through too.
You know, I've actually thought that too, but I feel like the way pre-fiat works, maybe reading the positions and like the literature in the positions is kind of like a gateway to like maybe pique people's interests outside of the world of debate, and so then it carries that interest through. So even if you aren't genuinely advocating for it, maybe it doesn't so much matter that you are genuine. It matters more that the words are being said.
Also, like what Emma said though, like a lot of times those words aren't being said, they're being read, right? So a lot of times you don't have to know exactly what you're saying to read a card, right? So
Right,
in that
but I mean, the words
situation,
are still said. Words still have meaning how we say them.
So how can we combat this system?
Just really quickly, I think.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say that like sometimes I understand that issues can be trivialized in certain debate rounds or debate spaces, but I do feel like it is a better alternative to debating styles of debate that are maybe not as critically engaging. So I think it's a better alternative to maybe just like straight util apps that everyone's going to read on the same topic, or just generic arguments that you're going to have the same routes over and over again. But like you were saying, like ever since camp, we did go to a camp that was predominantly based on gender or race or like those kinds of identities, and like figuring out a way to talk about them in a debate space because we understand that it's important. But I feel like it does open your eyes to much broader like notions of like this is bad, that I should not just be focusing about it in debate, but rather like everywhere else because you see it everywhere.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe there could be like an article series about it, like maybe on Debriefly or something that could help like properly engage in these positions, because especially like how the evidence like with these certain positions would indicate that have pre-fiat implications that these debaters are like disadvantaged in the community to a certain extent, and I guess like camps like TC help with that, like because you don't have the means to go to camp. That's just sort of a way to make it universally educational for everybody.
Right, I would agree with that. So I guess that was also the point of engagement, which I think, I don't know if anyone has read it, but Rodrigo and I wrote an article about how to engage these positions and, forms of engagement that we think are not only beneficial, but the right ways to engage. And so just like, not to advertise it, but I think it's a pretty decent way, which explains how to engage these positions more on a method level, rather than a question of whether these positions, should have been allowed to be read in the first place. I think I want to just bring it back a little bit. In terms of people's camps experiences again, do you think you've had an intellectually diverse camp experience, depending upon where you've gone? Or do you honestly think that a lot of times it only covered one subject matter and didn't really expand beyond what some might say one portion of the library?
In 2013, I went to the UNT policy camp, and well, kind of departing from LB, a lot of the same subject matter is still discussed. But in the context of that camp, we didn't really ever even kind of touch on any sort of identity debate. Like the K was gone over like briefly, but it was kind of I think boiled down to another like strategic method of like negating. There wasn't really any emphasis on what the significance of like, the criticism is outside of the debate room, like why we criticize things and why we look for like problematic rhetoric within different like methods of discourse. And I was really disappointed to not see like any sort of infrastructure for that discussion. And I can't say this is like me and Green's fault or whatever, because I know at the same time Eli Smith was playing videos of Kanye West as like a performance EC against Rebecca Kwong. So like obviously that discussion was happening. It was just in the little environment I was in, I didn't really get any exposure to that.
At TDC, what they did is they had every lab leader like shift around and teach other labs on different topics, which was really good because not only did you get like opinions and ideas from different points of view, but also you touched on every single subject for a full day. So it like opened up the space for at least us to talk about a lot of different things. And if it wasn't going the way that we liked it to, we could shape it how we wanted to, which I think was good because it was more in our hands and less in someone else's hands. So I think these programs work like that.
I think one important thing that we can all do once we graduate and we're teaching younger students, or that judges or coaches can do as educators, is to, when they're teaching these positions, is maybe give the real world implications. Like these are people's lives that we're talking about. It's not a Wilderson card you're reading. You're talking about real people and real impacts. And I think that maybe explaining those things to younger debaters when they're learning about these can actually help shape the way that we do look at these positions as not just positions, but actually something that matters.
Sort of off of that, I remember seeing a file from I think the 2011 TOC. I might be misremembering, but there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that the sort of debate model had led a lot of people to view the world via a lens of like impact scenarios, right? It's Maquiladoras in Mexico becomes a really cool app for living leadership, or say political instability in Thailand becomes a great like dissent scenario, right? And it's sort of the real world translates into like a body count, and that's within the confines of like a util type of debate, but I feel like that sentiment is still kind of throughout a lot of the debate community, just kind of in general, we sort of start looking for the disadvantage as a strategy. So I don't know exactly what the solution is, but like understanding that in all contexts, the things we speak about are things that exist in the real world. It's like Nietzsche doesn't just write a nice little book for the purpose of debaters saying, "Oh, suffering is good." Yeah, no, like he wrote that as a like his point of view of the world, and yeah, his ethics are probably a little bit out there. But the point is, these philosophers write about what's actually going on. They don't write from the point of some like academic gain, right? Yeah, sure.
So the other thing that I think like I wanted to discuss was kind of like gender and race in debate, because I had some like real world ideas of ways that tournaments could help make the playing field a little more equal. And one of the ideas that I thought would probably be beneficial is having at least one female in the tournament administration, because I think that that's something a lot of tournaments do lack. And not all, and some are pretty good about it, but if females have problems and they need to discuss something or there's an issue, I think that it's important that they have somebody that they can confide in. And I've seen tournaments that don't have that. And so I think that that's one thing. Another thing is I think that tournaments may or should, I think that they definitely should, kind of look at their numbers of people of color and women in their judge pool and try to correct for that if they notice that there's a big gap in that. And I think that the third thing that I had an idea about was that if men are invited to round robins that are, or like people of color, or like white people are invited to round robins, they should reject invitations if it is all men. Because I've seen like there's a big movement in the big business industry that if men are invited to panels that are all men, they should, like if they really truly are a feminist ally, they will reject those invitations as a sign that we don't want to participate in a system that excludes women.
Which just really quickly on that, one thing I've noticed a lot is a lot of people like to call themselves allies, but when the time comes and you have to make a decision about do I reject the invitation or not, oftentimes the you can go ahead and come in. Oftentimes the decision will be based upon self-interest rather than what would a true feminist ally do in that position or do in that situation. And really quickly on the point you made earlier, a lot of different out-rounds, statistics, and studies done show that a majority of the time women represent nearly 5% of the judging pool in out-rounds, and oftentimes, for example, in the NDT, the finals round was 5 white men, no diversity at all. Semis, it was 9 white men and 1, brown male. Other than that, I don't think there were many women in the out-rounds judging at all. And that's like just statistics done in college tournaments. I'm not sure if there are any in high school tournaments, but it's not a question of are we lacking diversity. We know we're lacking diversity. But oftentimes I think we just recognize the problems, but we don't do anything about it. And it's really the students that make up this activity that are going to end up being the ones who stay in the activity, make these decisions about who do we invite to tournaments, who do we hire to tournaments. And unless we, is my personal opinion, that unless we instill a sort of ethic that says, we need to actively do something to change these problems instead of just recognizing them, nothing is going to change. We're all just going to continue to recognize problems, but not take actual praxis.
Yeah, I think a lot of these discussions are like, we should recognize women in debate, we should like acknowledge that there's a problem, and not so many as like real, actual things that, or policy changes that can help. And I think tournaments can do something. They just choose not to because it's hard. I understand that there's like financial concerns, but really it's just necessary to like locate the problem and actually do something about it in terms of like correcting for the number of judges that are of color or that are women.
Yeah.
So for policy solutions, question, you mentioned setting like a ratio, like a demographic ratio,
Yeah.
kind of like a judge affirmative action, I guess. So what would the ratio be based in? Would it be based like in the racial demographics of the area or of like the participants in the tournament, or would it be universally done by like NFL or?
See, I think that that's a hard question because the way that I got a lot of these ideas were from articles discussing what real businesses do, because real businesses will count the number of people of color that they have within their business and how many promotions those people are getting. And so it's easier for them to do it right because the businesses will take the number of employees they have and then look at the numbers of people of color and women who are being promoted. So I think that, we could do something similarly. I just think that there would have to be a discussion like one that's happening.
So like when you set up like your NFL profile, and in addition to like your grade level and your gender, it asks for maybe your race.
Like maybe you could try to make it proportional to the number of competitors. If like there's a certain percentage that are female. I mean, I'm not sure.
And I think that's the point, that there's not one perfect ratio that says.
Well, yeah.
This is enough women, and then we cut it off, right? Like,
yeah.
I don't think that should be the way to do it. Like, okay, we met our female quota. Like, no, stop it.
But at the same time, I think trying to create some guidelines or at least regulations on how do we correct this is necessary. Again, a lot of the stuff I'm citing is from college, just because I know they specifically tried to do things like this. But college debate tournaments have done things like opt-in programs where they've specifically asked, people of color, and again, we are specifically mentioning race and gender, but this problem expands much more beyond that. We're just using them for the sake of examples. But they've specifically asked people who are normally not represented in the judge pools to continue to be represented. And at the Blake tournament this year, actually, there was specifically in the policy pool, they wanted college debaters and even college coaches who represent these identity arguments to come and judge in the pool to make it more diverse. And, tournaments doing things like that is probably an excellent idea, but the problem is a lot of tournaments aren't willing to adopt policies, or at least don't actively try to adopt policies like that. And I guess that's the one thing we're confused as to why that's not happening, and we should do that.
Do you know how the Blake tournament did that? Did they send out invitations for people to judge, or was it more proactive that made the difference?
Yes, the Blake tournament. I don't remember the name of the guy who runs the team, but the head of the Blake team specifically extended invitations to individuals who, he thought represented good educators in the community, and asked them to come to the tournament to judge.
I think the problem starts at a lower level. I think that inviting a more diverse judging pool isn't going to solve the problem. I think the problem starts at the younger ages when you're in high school and you're female or you're a person of color and you see, or you're a part of where you're not being engaged in the debate world. So I think that just being a person of color or being a female in the debate world discourages activity. And I think the first topic we talked about with the race theory and gender theory, I think those arguments are really important to debate because they're going to encourage, I think, women and students of color to stay in debate because they have more tangible arguments that they can.
I think it's a lot of chicken and the egg, we should have more judges, but also more people who can become judges. So what do you think we could do in terms of getting more people who are women or color to join debate? Because I think a lot are discouraged because they're not doing so well. You don't see a lot of women.
Just really quickly on that point, I think that when we run identity arguments, and I have definitely had this problem, and I continue to have this problem, is oftentimes when we're asked questions about the positions, and as people running these arguments, we find some of the basic assumptions that racism is bad, racism exists, people are oppressed now, to be just such obvious claims that we wouldn't question that racism exists now. And we usually respond with something that would, turn the person off about who's asking these questions. But we have to recognize that a lot of people asking these questions aren't intending, to prove racism doesn't exist or to prove sexism doesn't exist. But rather, a lot of people come from a background where these questions have never been asked, and they don't have that sort of knowledge beforehand when they're walking into the round. And so I think it's our job, as debaters running these arguments, to explain that these things do exist, explain the empirics. Because oftentimes when, I run Wilderson on the neg, people are like, Obama's president, whatever. You have to explain that, yes, while segregation laws have been de jure, yes, they have been abolished, the fact that it's still within communities that are predominantly poor, that the ratio, the racial ratio, is still majority African American, that those problems still exist. It is not because black people are too lazy to work, but rather it's still because structures of racism still exist. And without that explanation, I think people will just continue to be turned off by the positions because they don't understand them.
And I think the debate world creates a really unique setting for them because you've got a lot of kids who are into these really intellectual arguments, and we're running them, and it creates this dialogue that I think could be liberating for some people because they're hearing these arguments that they've never heard before. And so it's going to.
So this in December or November around that time, part of the Briefly team, I forgot what they call them, whatever, the kids who write articles, are supposed to write articles for them, etc. I chose to do one, which yet has been published in December, but whatever. The case is that I analyzed the top 100 debate squads. I don't know how they determine that. That are in the Briefly top 100 page or whatnot. And out of the 100 schools, it turns out that only 4 of these schools in the entire list are both have 50% or higher rate in more minorities and more kids that are socially disadvantaged. We're talking about 4 schools out of the top 100. That I think is showing how socioeconomic status really does affect diversity in the debate community. Not only that, but only 2 of those schools were in the top 50. And honestly, I can only name 30 schools or 35. the rest were like really down low. But like just think about the people who are winning all these like national tournaments or whatnot go to like very privileged schools and come from like very privileged backgrounds. And I think create more diversity in the debate community, it's really a structural problem in terms of like socioeconomic ability to afford these things. And I think that if we could hire more like judges that represent like those forms of identity or whatnot. But like what I don't know your name, but what she said is that like it really starts like at a young age or whatnot. And I think that a way to create diversity in terms of that is I think camps play a crucial role in this, and how tournaments play a crucial role in this. If one day my article gets published or whatever, there's a section that I indicate how I think how tournaments should, take care of these problems. For instance, I think that tournaments can waive fees for students who cannot afford these fees, or I think there could be a structure where, like, maybe it's so complicated that every tournament has to ask for the 1040 tax form or whatever. I think there could be like a system that like every I guess this is easier for like TOC tournaments because they all have to come through like some rules or regulations or whatnot. But like if the TOC committee was to like get like everyone's, well, at least those kids who applied for like a 1040 tax form, and they would just verify those kids and send out a list to those like tournaments, and the tournaments are willing to like waive those fees. I think that's such a great idea. Additionally, I also think that camps should be more open to offering like need-based scholarships, because a lot of the camps are just like not gonna name a camp, but I asked I sent oh, do you guys have like financial aid and stuff like that, pointed me to like another organization that was like independent of the camp. Like that really doesn't help that much. And I think that some camps are like so focused on like getting the best kids, or getting like the top debaters, or even providing them with full rights to their camp so that they can like look good, which really just is another form of lack of inclusion in our community. That scholarship that was put for that debater who represents that camp to make them look better could have been placed to some debater who is not necessarily who's probably not has a huge reputation but cannot afford to go to that camp. And it's things like that that discourage these people, because literally 4 schools in the top 100, that is insane. Like, it is just insane how many schools have 99% black and Latino people. And there's I was reading an article the other day. There's literally some schools that have 99% black and Latino people, and it would be harder to aggregate this data, but I wonder how many of those schools across the United States have debate programs, at all. I think it would be very minimal, but I think debate tournaments and debate camps should start becoming more financially accessible to people who cannot afford them.
I think that's also one reason why Abby and I specifically didn't want to be the only ones in this discussion, is because we recognize that we have a lot of opportunity. We get to fly across the country and debate at tournaments, which is why I think a diversity of voices is important. And on the other point which you said, I think one thing Mr. Timmons said before this tournament, which really, I've thought about it a lot, is the best debater in Texas could be somebody you've never heard of before. And I think that, articles have been written about this before, but this idea of certain debaters having access, this elite status within the community themselves, that, X debater is debating Y debater is clearly going to win. That's the same type of discouragement just all across the board, about which doesn't incentivize people to participate in this activity. And oftentimes those names which are given to people of, oh, they're clearly going to win, they won the Octos bid at, whatever tournament, are often created because they are given the advantages that Dino was talking about. So I think recognizing all of these different things, and, oftentimes recognizing how you are complicit in all of these different problems is probably pretty important.
And I think that one of the other things, and I think some tournaments have successful programs, especially Valley, about housing students for tournaments. I know some have fantastic programs and others are a little lacking, so maybe a more universal system where the students of a tournament or the host tournament will, offer to house, because I think that can also maybe help with the financial burden of tournaments.
I was just gonna say that I know at the beginning we were talking about arguments that are read in debate space that talk about gender or race arguments, but I think that one argument that really kind of goes ignored or that isn't like as talked about like, as much as other arguments is the fact that classism really does play a role in the everyday lives of people who not just live in the debate world or anywhere else or have access to debate, but the fact that there are people living in circumstances that they don't have another option to do the things that they may want to do, to go to tournaments or go to schools that they may want to go to have higher quality education or things like that. And I think that yes, people run like CAP-Ks and people talk about why like current structures are really, really bad for people living in impoverished conditions and things like that. But I think that like same thing with the race stuff. You can't just give statistics. You have to explain the meaning behind the statistics and talk about that these problems just aren't a card or a fact, but the fact that they really do exist in the real world. And I think that we can talk about all these problems as much as we want to, but unless solutions like we're coming up with right now don't really happen in the debate world and these problems aren't as big as well as they need to be, then we can't really do it.
I think a lot of like another huge issue is that there's so many people, like maybe not just in this debate community, but like I'm sure there's just an enormous amount of people that just think these issues don't exist at all. And I think like I've had personal experience trying to explain, like I used to be one of those people, and it took a long time for me to realize like wow, like this world is really messed up. So I think coming up with a way, like maybe like somebody writing an article or like putting together like statistics or a way to show people that inequality exists and that it's like in our faces, and being able to like finding a way to explain to people who just don't think this exists at all that it does exist. Because I think once that happens and once there's a greater amount of awareness, solutions will be a lot easier to find, and they might even like find themselves. Because I think the biggest problem is ignorance, and I think we should be able to solve that. Like there's so many people in here. I'm sure like if we just sat down and maybe like wrote down things, or, like wrote an article about this, like it'd be so much easier because it's really, really hard actually to explain to someone who just has no exposure to these things whatsoever. Like I spent hours looking up different articles, and, like looking up statistics, and it was still like they were like So like I don't know, any suggestions on how to like reveal privilege?
I think one of the issues is making people care about it, because it's an important issue and I think people should care about it. But like what Nolan said, a lot of people just don't. And while writing an article is definitely an incremental step and it might be productive, people sometimes just don't read articles that they don't get really interested in. So that's why I think sometimes the debate space might be useful, because it forces people to engage you on something you think is important. And then it gets to the distinction between performance debate and running arguments like this topically. And I have my own opinions on that, but I think that's what's something unique about the debate space. And I think that's why articles sometimes might not be as productive as we say they are. But what do you think are ways that we can get people to proactively care besides creating the competitive incentive in-house?
I mean, I have had this kind of problem a lot because I come from like a very predominantly white privileged area. So talking to people about different forms of like marginalization is very, very hard. I've kind of given up on reading statistics and stuff because I find that like every time I do, somebody's just like, oh, that source is biased, or oh, they're already all black or something like that. And it's like, did you really just say that type stuff? I find that it's a lot easier if you're trying to explain these kinds of issues if you use analogies or scenarios, right? Like real world things that happen to people, and put someone that they know in the place of the person that it's happening to. So I know that a few years ago there was a drag queen who had like a glass bottle thrown at the back of her head while she was walking down Montrose, right? And I was talking to my mom about it, and she was like, that doesn't actually happen. We live in Houston, right? It's a really nice area and stuff like that. Montrose is also pretty nice in and of itself. I told her that. I said, what if I was walking down the street? And I said, what if someone threw a glass bottle at the back of my head? What would you do about it, right? And it put it a lot more in terms that are personal to her, that she can understand, right? That like she can relate to them because it's someone that she cares about instead of just someone, you know? And I think that that's at least one way you can find to get people to care about it, is to use real examples that happen. Just substitute the person, because it could be anyone, right? There's no distinction that it stops someone from becoming socioeconomically disadvantaged. I know that like job loss happens all the time type stuff, right? Like this really can be anyone, and I think putting that in understandable terms to people is one of the easiest ways to make them understand like that this stuff can happen to anyone.
I think oh, sorry.
I really am on board with like Adam on this. I think probably the best way that we can as individuals go about like I don't know addressing and hoping to find some sort of solution to problems like this is just becoming like compassionate educators, right? Like as individuals in every scenario. Like I know for a really long time, I was suffering from like yeah, whatever. For the purpose of the discussion, I was suffering from bipolar disorder, and it was like really debilitating. And my dad was not very supportive or compassionate at all because he's never had to experience something like that in his life. He's always rub some dirt on it, think some happy thoughts, and go sing a happy song while you're working. It's like he doesn't have any sort of understanding for that. So it took a really long time for me to get him to the point where he realized that that was like illness, that wasn't laziness. It's a thing that, and part of the way that I was able to sort of communicate was that this to him was like using analogies, right? He's a veteran and he can sort of relate to ideas of like PTSD, okay? But whenever he would make some comment about like being so OCD because he wants to keep things 90 degrees on his desk. It's just simple kind of non-combative statements like that, I don't think you would appreciate it if I would talk about how I'm so PTSD whenever I get startled at a loud noise. Like, that's not, just finding terms, finding this common ground and, like, compassionately negotiating.
Being able to relate to others.
Yeah. Maybe we can promote discussion after the rounds, too. I think that debaters sometimes walk out of rounds angry and not wanting to discuss the things that they debated about. So I think maybe talking to your opponent after the round about their position, or why that matters, or talking to the judge after the round if the judge wants to really explain something that happened, could be something that could help with that issue. Go ahead.
I've been wanting to jump in for quite a while, but I guess before I say anything redundant, what's the basis of this? Like, what is the main?
Well, I guess we covered a couple of different topics. One was talking about identity arguments and debate in general, what tournaments can do, what camps can do to, maybe increase diversity.
I talked about women, we had a discussion about women in debate and how to promote them in terms of the judge pool, round robin invites, and tournament administration.
Right. As a Black Puerto Rican Native American female at a predominantly white school that's underfunded, I've vested, interest in this. I thought it was interesting what the past two people have said about, trying to get people to understand and how in order to truly understand you have to relate. And I think it's important to have discussions like this, but not just to have discussions like this, but frankly to let white males know that white males came to this discussion. So that it's not just like all the minorities and women came to this and it's just their problem. I think it's kind of a twofold issue in that we need diversity, but we need the means to have the diversity. We just kind of touched on earlier with like really qualified judges that should be on course or whatever. And again, like with certain schools have more funding, but a lot of schools they make their students pay entry fees. Like my school, up until this year, you had to pay for every event that you did, which turns off a lot of people from doing speech and debate at all. And a lot of, like, as president of my department, like, I noticed a lot of, like, the people who be the best debaters just didn't do debate because debate's the most expensive class. And, just getting schools to value speech and debate enough to want to fund speech and debate so that people can participate, or can go to more competitive tournaments. Like I was able to get funding from my school to cover entry fees, but that meant our travel budget was degraded. And so, whereas other schools in our circuit were able to go to the Harvard tournament and go to the Columbia tournament, we had to stay in the valley.
So I think it's really less so this is one that
You can finish.
yeah, it comes down to funding and then just feelings of inclusion and empowerment. Like people, like when we have these kinds of discussions, we need to let people know that people like them hang.
I think she pointed to a very important issue, which I sort of touched on in what I said last, which I think that socioeconomic status, I don't want to say it's the most important factor in terms of like creating a lack of diversity, but I think it's super important because debaters who probably have like unique features in their identity or whatnot are most of the time excluded because I think that those, for instance, from my experience, from my friends or whatever, it's usually the case that most African Americans are most of the time also socially disadvantaged compared to white males, right? And so if it's a case of money to attend a camp or to attend a tournament, it is no surprise that the activity is dominated by white males, right? So I think that as a form of resistance, and this is also specifically talking to debaters who get invited to like camps to get full rides to camps or stuff like that. Because I definitely know people who get full rides to certain camps or get like extra pay if they work at their camp. I really think that these debaters who are like super relevant in the activity and everyone looks up to should boycott camps that have those features, right? So like if you get asked to work for X camp and they have certain policies that disadvantage these forms of groups, and obviously I think it's a form of it's a structure that disables these types of like individuals from entering the activity, then I think people should boycott them because the reason why they don't, or the reason why the reason why there's not more accessibility for low-income students is because they care about money, right? So like people, so shifting funds from like merit-based scholarships, from need-based scholarships to merit-based scholarship, it's just a form to make the camp look better, to also attract people so other people can pay money to attend that camp or whatnot. And I really think that's like a very messed up structure because that money could have been spent for someone who really just does not have the ability to go. Rather, it was spent on someone to create publicity and image for the camp. And that type of ideology that is rooted in the camp structure or like whoever runs the camp or whatever is like super messed up. And I think that people who are big in the activity or even like who get special invitations or whatnot, that is a powerful chance for you to take a stance and boycott it. There might be more practical solutions, like I was talking to Akil about this over texting or whatnot, but I think it could be at least a form of resistance because you're not complicit in a system that functions to disadvantage certain groups.
I think that you have a really, really good point in terms of like minimizing the amount of discrimination that goes on in the camp environment. But I've just this whole time kind of been wondering, it's very great to talk about TOC or state or camps, but how much of this still applies to like smaller schools? Like, for instance, I come from a really small school, like basically a no-name school. I'm like the only year on my team, and it's definitely the only one that's here. And I was just, for maybe turn it to like, maybe you don't have the means to, discriminate, but like not in a bad way, between judges and be like, well, you can't judge, but you can, like tournaments that are like just trying to scrape to get by. What if a school doesn't really have the means to do this kind of quota thing? Are there steps that those schools can take too, or is this only the kind of stuff that can be implemented like in really big, really rich schools and tournaments? Because I think it's important that I think smaller tournaments don't matter because of what someone said earlier, like the best debater could be someone you never met. Because they could be from
actually that man right there.
yeah.
Shout out to you.
And say the best debater could be someone you never met. And they could be going to these small tournaments. but they could also be discouraged from participating because the small tournaments don't have the means to participate in non-discriminatory practices. So if we're talking about how to do this, how do people from small schools do this?
So I think that all the discussions happened so far have been focused on like camps and tournaments and stuff like that, getting money to people who can't afford it. But I don't think we should think that small. I know that I have reached out to my brother's law firm, for instance, to fund travel trips for tournaments and stuff. I went to Isidore Newman on fully paid by my brother's law firm, right? Because I contacted businesses and people who are interested in what they think that like debaters are and debaters can become and stuff, because people do care like about the activity as a whole and about like the image that the debater represents. And I think that there are other sources for like financial investments and stuff that like people are definitely willing to like pay you to do this. And you don't even have to be good or big or recognized. If any local school goes to a local business around there, I don't know for sure, but like I know that I have had some success with getting funding or money from Starbucks, even from right around the Woodlands, right? Like anyone's willing to pay you money if you can give them a reason to, and I think that debate is a great reason, right? And I think that if we have these kinds of discussions with the people who have money in the first place, I don't know a lot of rich people who are just like, oh, you're poor and you want to be a good person? No, I'm not going to give you money. I'm pretty sure lots of people will be very, very receptive and open to funding smaller school debate programs or like single debaters even. Like I know that I don't have a school, so everything that I have to do, I pay for by myself, and I know that that is incredibly challenging and stuff, and I know that I would not be able to do it were it not for my brother's law firm, for instance, because they really, they really have funded my entire debate career. Without them, I wouldn't even be here. I wouldn't have had the tournaments to qualify to state, for example. So.
Okay, this has been really great, but we gotta be respectful of everyone's time. So.
Yeah. It's 45 minutes.
We said we'd end it now, and we will.
So we wanted to thank everyone for coming.
This has been really great.